Hello and welcome to a new episode of Reptile TV. My intro critter that I want to show you today is an Iranian leopard gecko or Iranian fat-tailed gecko. They are scientifically called Eublepharis ankhramenju. So the great thing is that they can actually grow to be these huge creatures. So look, have you ever seen such a big leopard gecko? At first glance, they really look just like the classic Eublepharis macularius, but they have a slightly different pattern. So I think an insider would say, no, that's not a macularius. And they also get significantly bigger. So I think an insider would say, no, that's not a macularius. And they get even bigger. This is an adult male. If he continues to grow, he will reach similar sizes. But he is still young. He is only 2 years old. So if he keeps growing, eating and thriving throughout his life, he will definitely reach similar sizes and might even grow another centimeter or so. Yeah, really huge leopard geckos, the Iranian ones, are my intro critter for you today. You can go ahead and post below whether you've ever seen such a giant leopard gecko or not. Today's topic is once again about how to save some money in reptile keeping. You can go ahead and post below whether you've ever seen such a giant leopard gecko or not. Today's topic is once again about how to save some money in reptile keeping. We hear it every day in the news, on TV, that everything is getting more expensive, money is getting scarcer, and we're all getting poorer. That's why we need to find a way to save some money. And some people be trying to save a bit of money in the hobby, and that's where the food comes into play. How can I save money on feeder animals, in reptile keeping, besides comparing prices while shopping and checking where you might find something cheaper? You can also save money by breeding your own feeder animals. Whether it's breeding rodents yourself or breeding insects yourself, both of those are definitely doable. We've already done episodes about that and we'll link them below. You can check how it works. That's definitely the means to an end. I've listed how you can save money. Whether you actually save money and the pros and cons in this episode of Reptil TV for you. One pro of breeding your own is definitely that if you do it right, you know in the end that you've produced healthy food using healthy raw materials to feed your feeder animals. No matter if it's insects or rodents, if you've set up a well thought out breeding system, you can be sure that these feeder animals are good and healthy. And as I said, they're also a healthy food source for your terrarium pets. And you can also, provided that you do it well and correctly, ensure that you've bred them in the best possible way for their species. Those are definitely two pros. So you can ensure healthy food bred in a species appropriate way if you do it yourself. The next point is that you always have the right size. Whether it's food, insects or rodents, you need different sizes. You have young animals, larger animals. Either I need small crickets, I need medium ones, or with the mice, I need an XL mouse or I need a baby mouse. If you breed them yourself, you usually have all sizes of food always on hand. Yeah, and like I said, that's the background. You can save cost if you produce it yourself. You're not dependent on buying it somewhere. The better and more skillfully you do it, the more costs you can ultimately save in the whole process. Then we also have the cons. If you breed your own, one point is definitely the initial investment for all the breeding materials. So you might want to do a little calculation for yourself first to see if it's even worth it. For example, breeding rodents, a rodent cage with a bottle and everything. You buy it new, costs around 50 to 60 euros. You can also find quite a few used acrylon cages with bottles online. You can probably get them for about 10 to 20 euros, I would say. But you also need several cages. One is not enough. If you can breed semi-professionally, you need several cages, maybe even a rack to put them on. So you need to think about the costs for the initial setup. It's exactly the same with insect breeding. You need the breeding containers where you keep the insects, some kind of plastic trays, possibly with a lid, or even better, with a lid. So you'll be spending some euros there first before your breeding starts. Then you have additional costs, electricity costs for insect breeding for sure, because you need to keep it warmer. So room temperature is usually too cool for breeding insects, so you need to heat it up a bit or possibly provide some lighting. For rodent breeding, You definitely don't need heating, but you might need fans to exchange the air in the room, or air purifiers in the room. So you definitely need to include the electricity costs in your calculations. Another point is, of course, that you'll also need to spend money to feed your feeder animals. You don't just need feeder animals, you need to buy food for your feeder animals. Whether it's pellets for the rodents, or flakes, or any kind of food for the insects. So you have costs that you need to keep in mind. You shouldn't neglect the smell when you're breeding, especially if you're breeding yourself. It's definitely more extreme with rodent breeding. Even with insect breeding, you'll have a certain smell. Maybe not quite as bad as with rodent breeding. That's definitely a point. I don't know if I really want to have a mouse or rat breeding setup in my apartment. And I think I might need a separate room or a basement or maybe a shed or something where I can do that. And one more point, it kind of bothers me a bit that I have so many counterpoints, but they're just there. Another downside might be allergies. If you're like me, I have a bit of an allergy to rodents. So I personally couldn't start breeding mice and rats for myself. I definitely have an allergy problem. So I personally couldn't start breeding mice and rats for myself. I definitely have an allergy problem. And the same goes for the feeder insects. So for was ergeht. They have a pretty high allergy potential. Mealworms and cockroaches have a very high allergy potential. But also crickets, especially maybe the bran that you use to feed the crickets, you definitely need to be careful with that. So I'm speaking from my own experience. If you are a poor allergy sufferer like me, then I would honestly advise you against the whole thing. If you're any kids from the countryside or even city kids who have nothing to do with allergies, then that point probably isn't important for you. My conclusion about the whole thing is that if you have a lot of terrarium animals, like a big snake breeding setup with 50 or 100 snakes, then I think it could definitely be worth it, and it's something to consider. If you have a lot of lizards, it's also worth considering whether you should start a breeding program. Cockroaches earlier. Or if you have a lot of lizards, it's also worth considering whether you should start a breeding program. Or I just mentioned the topic of cockroaches. I think out of all the feeder insects, cockroaches can actually be the most profitable. So cockroaches are really a very good food source. And on top of that, they can be bred quite easily. And I have different sizes of cockroaches that I can use to feed my terrarium animals. So I think out of all the feeder insects, cockroaches are probably the ones that can be bred the easiest and most productively. And those are Argentine cockroaches. So even if something goes wrong in the apartment, nothing happens. So if the number of terrarium animals you have justifies it, then it's definitely worth considering as an alternative to save on food costs. Another alternative is, of course, to look for deals when shopping, maybe buy in larger quantities or set up some kind of subscription for the insects, which is usually a bit cheaper than buying them individually every week. Or especially with frozen food, you can also go ahead and if you have a good supplier for frog food, then the animals are really fresh. Another alternative is, of course, to look for deals. When shopping, maybe buy in larger quantities or set up some kind of subscription for the insects, which is usually a bit cheaper than buying them individually every week. Or when it comes to frozen food, you can also go ahead and if you have a good supplier for frog food, then the animals are really fresh. So you can keep them in the freezer for at least 6 months, or probably even 9 months, or even up to 12 months. And if you buy maybe 100, instead of just one mouse, you'll definitely get a much better bulk price. So I could imagine that this is also a point or a calculation you can make and say, well, if I buy in bulk and get a good deal, maybe in the end I actually save more than if I were to breed everything myself. And lastly, when it comes to feeder insects, well, you can't do that with rodents, but with insects, you can really catch what's called meadow-plankton in nature. At least for about half the year, you can go outside with a net and catch all sorts of insects, to put it bluntly, like grasshoppers or anything that's hopping around outside. As I said, in colloquial or terrarium language, that's what you call meadow-plankton. You certainly have a very healthy food that doesn't cost too much if you catch it. It doesn't cost you anything except for time, really. So I can imagine that to catch enough, you really have to spend about half an hour to an hour in the field running around with a net, catching and sorting out various things. Whether it's the right size, time-wise it probably won't pay off, but if you enjoy it or like being out in nature, it might still be a nice thing to do, and you can definitely save on food costs. That was the episode, so you save money on food. I'm sure you have ideas or tips about this too. So feel free to post them below, like that's a good idea, or you can do it this way, or how you can save a bit more. I'm looking forward to your feedback. Give a thumbs up if you liked it. Of course, subscribe to the channel. You're always up to date on how you can save or do it right. Yeah, and otherwise stay loyal to me and check words.